Forward to this. Cool. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the October edition of the New and Early Career Faculty Workshop Series. Just to kind of talk a little bit about next month, which is a really exciting one, extracurriculars and cybersecurity. We're going to be talking everything competitions, clubs, everything extra that our students can do outside of the classroom. Friday, November 22nd. We're also going to have some special guests, so stay tuned for those announcements as we kind of go through there. And then we are going to have one more for this semester on Friday, December 20th. We're going to be covering business continuity and risk management. So another fun one there as well. And I know Gretchen was just talking about next semester. We are going to start planning for that. So please pass our information along to your networks if they have a topic that would be really fitting for new and early career faculty to help us kind of further the discussion of teaching and all this amazing stuff that we're doing within the CAE community and reaching out to our younger faculty. So please feel free to email us and send all that information. It's all in the chat. Any questions? Anything else to add, Gretchen? Now that we're
I
on
don't think,
morning.
yeah, no, it was just my shameless plug up front. No, thanks, Paige, for everything.
Mhm. Okay. Cool. Okay, so today we have a very exciting topic of adversarial thinking, and I get to introduce myself today. Um, So I created this presentation with Deveeshree. She unfortunately cannot make it today, so you will only hear me, but I have a very special guest, Zoe Fowler, who'll be joining me for a conversation around the relevance of adversarial thinking to the workforce, and more specifically about how this can relate to helping our students gain competence around employability and getting them ready to go out into the workforce. So we have a really exciting kind of setup today. Plan is to really just go over what is adversarial thinking first, talk a little bit about all the different elements of it, and then kind of talk about the workforce a little bit. And obviously, knowing this topic, we need to bring in a little bit of ethics as well. And then I kind of pulled a lot of examples of where adversarial thinking can kind of get woven into curriculum at a bunch of different levels. And Deveeshree and I know, talked about this, where we can really kind of inject adversarial thinking into things that we might already be teaching in our classes. So that'll kind of be what we wrap up with. Please drop any questions you have throughout the presentation in the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on that to try and answer as many as I can. And we can kind of go from there. So we know that cybersecurity is a lot more than just all these technical skills that we teach our students. Although those are very, very important, cybersecurity is inherently very interdisciplinary. We pull from a lot of different fields, computer science and mathematics. We have some military science and psychology. We do sociology, project management, biology now with biometrics and things of that nature, as well as political science, especially going into the season that we're in right now. And being able to kind of meld all of this together really lies with who is actually doing cyber and who are the vulnerabilities and the threats. And that's the people. Those are all of the people that are either building these systems, going after these systems, or trying to really do anything with them. I know one of the things I was always taught early on was that humans are your biggest adversary, just in general, and they could do it accidentally or on purpose. So being able to kind of teach this to our students is super important because at the end of the day, when we're building any type of cyber defense, or if we're building any type of system to protect it, we have to be thinking about the people that are actually going to use it. And that's really where adversarial thinking fits in. And if you're really looking for someone within our community that talks a lot about adversarial thinking, Seth Hammond is definitely someone to look for. There's actually a lot of videos on the CAE community YouTube from, I think, about 2 years ago, where he really talks about adversarial thinking and how it's kind of woven into how he teaches. And I'd really encourage you guys, if you are really interested in this topic, even after this, to go and check that video out. I can also provide that in the slides when I send them out. But when we're thinking about adversarial thinking, there's a lot of different definitions. And even if you kind of Google this, I've asked ChatGPT, I've asked Gemini, there's not really one definition. And I've heard a lot of like the hacker mindset, think like an attacker, think like an adversary. But there's not really one single definition that can really encompass what this is. I kind of like this last definition that I put on here, the ability to mentally model how things can break. So it's a little focused on the system, less on the people, but I think it really can help some of our more technical students at least get started with adversarial thinking. And when we think about the elements of adversarial thinking, there's a lot of components to this. It's not necessarily something that we can teach as a skill. It's not necessarily something that is a task that someone complete. It's almost a mindset that students and professionals have to adopt when going about building different types of systems. And the first one is really understanding the adversary. And this is where psychology comes into play and sociology. I know when I teach my cyber war section of my introduction class, I always talk about the different, state actors that could be our adversaries if we're looking at it from a national security perspective. And then when I talk a little bit more about enterprises, we can talk about, advanced persistent threats, these people that might be planted in an organization to get information. It can be, bots put in, malware. So when we're really talking about understanding an adversary, it really changes depending on if you're looking at it from like national security, if you're looking at it from an enterprise systems perspective, even if we're looking at it from an academic perspective. The adversary is always going to be different. And it really starts with understanding in order to get to the next couple of things on this list. Anticipating attacks really comes into understanding what the adversary can do. So after you've understood who is the enemy, who is the hacker, who is going to be doing bad, whatever that may be, you have to then kind of take the next step forward to understand what they could possibly be coming after. And I think risk assessment really comes in here. Understanding what our assets are and how those can be vulnerable and how those can be exploited, I think really fits in nicely here. And I'll talk a little bit about how I teach secure software development in a little bit. And this really fits into that first kind of step of the software development lifecycle. Simulating actions, making sure that we can do different types of penetration testing, and teaching our students that these are things that will help make our defenses better by simulating the different types of things that could happen to our system to understand, number one, how our system can react, and also how the people that are working within that system can react. So incident response and things of that nature. Challenging assumptions is something that I ask my human factors class to do a lot. We all have an idea of how the system is built, and this is how I kind of present it to them. We all have, our little parts of the system we know really well. There might be someone who knows the login really well. There might be someone who understands the specific dashboard really well. And they have specific assumptions that they've adopted while they've been learning to build whatever system we're building in that class. And being able to kind of be your own proofreader in a way and finding the areas where actions can occur that would be detrimental can be a really hard thing to get my students to do. And I think it gets them a little bit uncomfortable. But I think that's really where they start to learn, where they start to really understand, like, okay, I'm going to have specific requirements that might not always be on the surface. I might have to think critically and kind of dive into those a little bit more. And I feel like this is probably one area where I, as kind of a newer educator, have been really trying to make it easy for my students to challenge the assumptions within small groups or within the class, so they can get practice with it, because this is something that's really challenging, even for me, as I'm kind of going through the material as well. And then finally, continuous improvement. This is something that I really harp on to my operations students as well as my IT students, that, everything is going to get better as we kind of iterate through, and really kind of leaning on agile principles here, where we're going to have an understanding of our adversary at one point, but then it's going to change. I mean, we've seen so much change over the past several months and several years within cybersecurity that there's AI systems now that might be our adversary. Our adversaries are using AI. So being able to not only continuously improve our system, but then also continuously improve our understanding of these adversaries is really a key element, to really teach our student that we might understand it right now, but that might be a very different story in, even 2 days or 6 weeks. So I guess the question I kind of want to ask everyone, do you think that adversarial thinking can be taught? And as I've kind of gone through the first couple iterations of my intro to cyber class, I've gotten kind of a mixed bag of responses from educators that are a little bit more experienced. Some say yes, some say no. So I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. If you'd like to come off of mute or if you'd just like to drop it in the chat, feel free.
I would say there's some components of it that can be taught, right? Like you can show like how you can do it, but I think there's also like that if you're not a I don't know how to say this really. If you're not like a really a dishonest person or somebody who is like risky in the way it is, right? It's hard to think about that. But if you're a person, not saying like you're a bad person, but if you've been able to if you're a good liar, if you're good, you can trick people, you can get people to believe things, right? I think that's a trait of people
Mm-hmm.
that can't be taught, right? Like I think
Yeah.
there's certain concepts of it, but like being a con person or being like someone who is maybe will cross the line, that's a
Mhm.
trait of people, whether you want to look at it as being good or bad, right? But like I think sometimes that trait could be turned into good, right? If
Mhm.
you're as long as you know how to like harness it, right? Like
Mhm.
and
Absolutely.
show the responsibility that goes with it.
Yeah, and making ethical judgments there. So almost teaching that ethics portion to those students that might have that inherent trait to put that hat on. That's why I always present that to my students is you're wearing your hat, your bad hat, or whatever you want to call it at the moment. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Mhm. Anyone? I was taught to count to 10 before I move on, so I hit 10.
Um, I could I
Yeah.
could offer. Sorry, I was giving it a thought.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I don't entirely disagree with Rob over there, but I mean, if you want to say you have to be a person who has lied or deceived, but we're all guilty of at least lying. I mean, everybody does it in childhood, right? So we
Mhm.
all know, we all understand it. But I would say, and I asked my wife, she said as well, yes, you could, because I mean, how do you think we train the police to think like criminals? We show them the activities that happen. If a police officer can be trained in understanding the criminal,
Mhm.
then I think yes, it can be done. It might take more effort for some people to learn it than others, but this is true about anything.
Mhm.
I always tell my students there's no such thing as people being born smart unless they're savants or something like that. But you can be smart just by learning, like studying, right? It's just it takes some people to come longer to get to the solution than others, it doesn't mean you can't get there. It just takes longer, So
Mhm.
yes, I think you can.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I've heard the same argument for leadership. There's some people that have that inherent trait, but then there is people that just need that little bit of extra push to really bring that out about them. And sometimes you have to do it different ways. Hmm. Yeah. Anybody else?
One of the things that I really like that you're doing here is that recognition that learning and teaching are not the same things. And oftentimes they don't even map one on one. We
Mhm.
think we're teaching one thing, but the learning experience can be quite different or only partial or exceed what we think we're teaching. And I really like that idea of, how do we coach that adversarial thinking, which bits can be taught and which bits have to be nurtured or grown in a different way.
Mhm. Absolutely. Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yep. So I just wanted to pose it out there, see if anybody had any thoughts on that. But I definitely think that we can teach parts of it. But there is parts that we have to coach, kind of to Zoe's point. And I think that will happen also for our students, even after they leave us and they have their degree and they're out in the workforce, as they're looking to grow in their careers, they're going to have to almost figure out how to learn from these different experiences. And hopefully we can give them the tools to do that as we get started in here. So that kind of leads us very nicely into the next portion here. So what is the relevance to the workforce here? And I'm going to give Zoe just a second to like introduce herself and what she does. And then we were hoping to have a conversation with everyone around, how this fits into what we're teaching our students and how we're getting them ready to go out and be competent members of the workforce. So I'll give her a second just to introduce herself so everybody knows who she is.
That's great. And I love the idea of you inviting me along today to do like a fireside chat with you. It's always such a pleasure to kind of get that chance to talk with you, Paige. So I'm Zoe Fowler. I am part of the Careers Preparation National Centre, which is one of the CAE national centres. And we've really been tasked with thinking about building bridges between what we're doing in the classroom and what our graduating students need to be able to do in the workplace. To borrow the phrase of my colleague Ran Hinrich, who's also part of that national centre, it's how we make our students breach ready. It's how we make sure that our students, when they're taking on these jobs, and I think particularly around adversarial thinking, are able to operationalise the things that we've taught them in effective ways. If, for example, you're going into industry, that might not be a good learning environment to start working out some of these ethical dilemmas or learning how to have that kind of agile thinking. And therefore, how can we provide space within our curricula for our students to develop those things which they need to have had the experience of before they go into the workplace? One of the ways that we're building bridges is through our definition of competency. Competency is the ability for a student to complete a task in the context of a work role. And it's in that context of a work role which is really relevant to this slide. When we're thinking about any of these things, we're thinking about how this cybersecurity ecosystem, this cybersecurity workforce, which is changing and rapidly evolving, how that's been mapped out by other organisations. That's way beyond the scope of what we can do as educators. But there are organisations that do that. So we have the NICE framework defines cybersecurity as a workplace in terms of work roles. Those work roles aren't descriptions of jobs. They're the kind of things people are likely to do within jobs. They're like kind of clumps of tasks and the requisite knowledge and skills which are part of that. The NICE framework tends to look more towards industry. We also have the DoD's DCWF, their workforce framework. Their workforce framework shares a common foundation with the NICE framework, but it has slightly wider breadth. It's looking across a larger operational landscape than solely cybersecurity. So when we're thinking as educators about what we're doing with our students, it's worth just building bridges to those workforce frameworks, which are describing kind of things that our students will be doing in the workplace, and also those kind of things that our students might aspire to do. So that's kind of my work. Paige, is that enough? Is that
Yeah.
kind of gives a...
Cool. Yeah, it's always great to talk with Zoe about the competence that I might be building with my students. And as we were preparing to do this presentation, we had a wonderful conversation about how the adversarial thinking is going to fit into a lot of what our students might have to do, and kind of fitting are the work roles that they might be going into. And I know for the CAE redesignation process, that's going to be something that all of us are going to have to kind of look at, like, what do our programs prepare our students to do and what work roles are there? So I went through the DCWF, and I kind of just pulled a handful of work roles that had knowledge statements or skill statements that kind of lend themselves to thinking like an adversary or thinking along the lines of a hacker, being able to understand those. And I just put a few of them up here on the screen. They don't necessarily tie to maybe specific things our students are going to get paid to do. I know Vinny loves to say that about tasks. But you're going to need this mindset in order to successfully complete those. And this is really on a scale. There's certain work roles that are going to require a heavy amount of adversarial thinking, especially more so. And I know Renee talked about law enforcement. When we're thinking about cybercrime, we're going to have to put that hat on. And it's going to go into darker places than maybe an exploitation analyst or a software test and evaluation specialist. And I recently attended a really interesting seminar on cybercrime investigation, and specifically cyber forensics, and how there does have to be that level of, okay, I'm thinking like an adversary right now, but I have to take that hat off and I can't always be wearing that, and kind of like drawing those ethical lines. And I know that's something we really wanted to talk about today around employability, because being ethical, being able to critically think, being able to kind of make those decisions is something that we can help our students learn how to do. And that was one thing that we really were having a great discussion about. And Zoe, if you have anything to add with that.
I guess I was just thinking, we met at NCEC as well, and we had some good conversations at the NCEC symposium that just took place. And there really is a shift across the CAE community as a whole from thinking in terms of inputs. That's the way that we can shape the knowledge and skills that we're going to, in a way, deliver to our students as though we're delivering a product, to beginning to think about outputs in terms of what we want our students to be able to do. And that shift of focus from inputs to outputs is happening, I think, across the field. And I think, as you said, Paige, this is in response to the fact that attacks change and evolve, that our students need to be able to think upon their feet, not only in terms of the courses that we're delivering to them, but also in terms of what's going to happen when they go out into the field. And when I look at the work roles that you're defining here, I'm thinking about how important that lifelong learning and self-reflection is within that, because there is no textbook definition of the kind of situations that you would face in any of these work roles. The students have to be able to grow and occupy and evolve within that role. And I think as educators, part of our need is to allow them to become that kind of reflective, self-critical, lifelong learning individual.
Absolutely. Is there anything anybody else would like to add? Have you had any experience working with students, maybe over a period of time, and seen some of these things evolve as they've started to understand a little bit more about what you're teaching them?
So, hi, I'm Elizabeth Rasnick. I'm at the University of West Florida, and I've taught a variety of classes, from everything from an intro to cyber class to ethical hacking and those sorts of things. And what I'll say is giving them the textbook and having them read case studies helps them pick up the terminology.
Mhm.
But when I really see the transformation in their thinking process is when I have them actively engaged in breaking things or defending things. And so virtual lab spaces are very helpful with that. But I've found things like competitions like National Cyber League, you're able to incorporate those into your classes, and then they're something about that competitiveness to it causes them to really want to drill into understanding, not just being able to regurgitate a definition, but really understand what it means to harden a network so no one can get into it, or to design an email so that it really does pass as a legitimate email when in fact it's a phishing email kind of thing. So I think that hands-on really makes a big difference in getting that thought, that thinking transition in their heads.
That's such a good point. And it reminds me, Paige, when we were meeting in preparation for this, you talked a lot about how you felt so much of competence is about confidence and those opportunities to build confidence. I don't know if you want to speak about that here or if that's something you're coming back to, but I thought that was such a great point that you made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think giving students those hands-on, like I can do this. It's not just something that they read in a textbook that it's going to almost be hanging above their head. Like I'm going to have to figure out how to do this one day. You can make that one day today, by giving them those opportunities to be in that competition. And I know my students love competition all the way. Just doing like a Kahoot in class gets them so much more engaged than doing even like a question lecture. So I definitely think like incorporating those online lab environments, those have been invaluable to me, because especially teaching maybe a hybrid class, I teach one of those, and my students might not be on campus, and being able to have them spin it up and go and do it in their own time or whenever they're doing it has been super valuable. And yeah, the confidence piece, I think just the hands-on gives them that confidence. They're like, I could do this. I could talk about it. So I completely agree that incorporating that into the lectures on top of that textbook reading, or like reading through my slides or listening me drone on for 45 minutes about how important it is to think like an adversary, kind of builds that confidence.
We've got some research coming out on how competitions are helping with this as well, to build on Elizabeth's point. So my colleague Dan Manson has been doing a lot of interviews with competition participants who've subsequently gone into workplace. And one of his key concepts is around muscle memory. He has this notion, which I best understand when I think about martial arts. So in martial arts, you learn a range of discrete movements. And a lot of time you're doing patterns of those movements. You're really establishing them as something that you do. The reason for doing that is to make it almost automatic if you're in a situation where you're sparring. So all the movements that you're learning as you're training to be a martial artist, you are probably not going to ever use in one discrete sparring match or fight. However, the fact that you develop this bank of muscle memories, this bank of resources, which you can then draw upon when you need to use them, is what makes you effective. And what we're seeing in cybersecurity competitions is that it provides that opportunity for students to have developed those discrete moves, to have built that muscle memory, and then to be making those choices of being able to select from the resources that they have and operationalizing the things that they need to do in that moment, in that attack, in that part of competition. And I think that also fits with confidence, knowing you've got that toolkit behind you, knowing that you've got that suite of things that you can choose from in a moment when you might need them.
I use the toolbox analogy with my students too. This is something that you might not have to do every day, but this is something that will help you. I tell them to learn Linux, add that to their toolkit. Is there anything else from anybody? Do you have any last items, Zoe? Did we miss anything? I'm forgetting.
Still in terms of our conversation, yeah, we talked a little bit how we also inspire our students. And again, I think that fits on Elizabeth's point as well. And it also links back to when Mark Gorak from Department of Defense was talking at NCAC. He was talking a lot about, we don't just want our students to learn, but we also want our students to become inspired. If this is what they're going to do in the future, we want them to be exploring and discovering and imagining. And I think a lot of what we're doing, and it seems when you talk about your teaching Paige, a lot that always strikes me is how we can inspire our students by providing those really exciting opportunities. As Elizabeth says, giving them those opportunities to break something so that they can explore, so that they can get their hands dirty and they can discover what their passions might be, because ultimately we know that students who are going to be most successful in their careers are those which are working in an area of which they feel passionate. And then the final thing I think we talked about as well in our kind of fireside chat before this was we were also talking about, whilst there's this really important aspect providing the opportunities for students to do the hands-on things, the real return on investment can be in the hot wash afterwards, where the students are reflecting upon what they've done and the role that we can take as educators in helping to facilitate those reflections. And circle back to Dan Manson's work on competitions. Participating in competition has a really high value for the student, but an equivalently high value is had from providing that opportunity for students to talk after the competition. And often the most valuable learning hasn't necessarily taken place within those winning teams. It's taken place within the teams where things haven't quite worked out, and they're able to reflect on it and understand what they might do differently next time. And in many cases, when we're talking to the employers who are going to competitions to hunt for talent, they don't always pick off the winners. sometimes they're looking for those students who are able to talk about what they learn when it didn't quite work out. Those students who perhaps made a mistake, but therefore have had that really valuable learning opportunity from that. And I think that's kind of central to adversarial thinking as well, because we learn best when things aren't straightforward. We learn best when there's that little bit of a challenge, when we have to figure out why our solution didn't quite work or why we were not as secure as we thought we were going to be.
Yeah, I agree. And also building in the parts of the toolbox that you can learn to pull out. There's going to be certain things that, I mean, I've seen it with my students too. They didn't even think that they would need to know something. And then I give them a lab and they're like, oh, you really just needed to know how to do this simple command in Linux. I've heard that so many times. They're like, it's as easy as just knowing the flags. Yeah, that's why it didn't work. But it's that building of the toolbox that you were talking about a little bit before, Zoe. The learning how to use those tools is one thing. You can't just give everybody a screwdriver and expect them to be able to use it for what they need. You have to kind of maybe like push them along a little bit in the direction that they need to go. And giving them those hands-on experiences, I think, is one element of teaching them how to use their toolbox. We can give it to them all they want, but they have to be the ones to figure out how to use it. Mhm. Anything else from anybody else? Mhm. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think inspiring my students is a big part of why I like to teach and why I got into teaching to begin with. And I think seeing the work that competency is helping educators kind of start to communicate that to their students that like, hey, these are things that you can get paid to do. I love saying that to my students now. I'm like, somebody will pay you to set up these accounts or to go and read these logs. And they're like, really? I didn't know that. Yeah, you could put this on your resume. You could talk about it in an interview. And I think like working with Zoe over the past couple of years has really opened my eyes to a different way of teaching and a different way of looking at what I'm teaching. Just to kind of plug her a little bit. Yeah, but okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, Zoe. And I hope everyone's feeling inspired now because I'm hoping to give you guys some examples of how to work this into your teaching, depending on where you're fitting into it. But first, ethics. Very important, I think, for everyone to not only just work into their teaching, I think it's really important to also kind of instill this in our students. And I know that we require ethics classes and all of this, but ethics really needs to be woven in the same way we have to weave adversarial thinking in. I'm not going to go into like every single detail, but I'm just going to kind of give you my perspective on it and how I have kind of worked in ethics in different ways. The first thing that I always kind of talk about to my students, because they find this really cool and exciting, especially in my introduction to cybersecurity class, is this idea of ethical hacking. You get to break stuff legally. They're like, that is so cool. But I also have to kind of stress that this is something that takes a lot of technical skill, but it also takes a lot of those more professional and softer skills. What is that line in the sand? Ethical hacking doesn't mean that you get to do whatever you want. It really means that we are going to be doing it in an ethical manner. And what does that mean? And what does that look like for the organization that you are going to be a part of? What does that look like for you as a person with morals and your own beliefs? So I try to stress that a lot, especially when I'm talking about like network security, penetration testing, and things like that. Responsible disclosure is something that I talk about a lot when I talk about the software security supply chain, especially when it comes to different types of CVEs. When I introduce the CVE database, I like to talk about responsible disclosure during that portion of my lecture. So that way my students can start to connect, okay, there were these 0-day vulnerabilities that were found, or there was this bug or something like that that were disclosed. And then here's the patch that went out to fix them. So that they can start connecting that there are people out there that are looking out for our software, looking out for the security of our software. The idea of dual use knowledge is something that I like to give to my students when we're talking about like network security or cyber policy and law. Because when we're thinking about network security, we're thinking about, okay, let's harden that network. Let's make sure that we have good authentication and authorization practices. But then being able to almost flip that to say, okay, what are bad authentication and authorization purposes and things like that. And when I talk about cyber law and policy, writing laws and writing policy is really kind of looking at this from two different perspectives. Okay, these are the worst things that could happen. And these are the things that have happened, and we need to write policy and write protections around that. But then on the flip side, how can we kind of use that same knowledge of what could go wrong to then build better systems around those policies? And this is something that I'm still working through how to teach effectively. If anybody has any insights into that or ideas, please feel free to throw them out as we're kind of going through my ideas of teaching and some of the ones that Deveeshree has shared as well. I also bring in compliance when we start talking about cyber policy and laws, like what are the things that we absolutely have to do and what are things that maybe aren't even written down. The one thing that keeps coming up pretty consistently in all my classes, and I get a lot of questions, is like AI compliance. Like, what does secure AI look like? What does like that using AI for cyber look like? What kind of data can I give AI? And I love to bring up the cases where people are getting, fired because they're putting in confidential information into ChatGPT. And I think that really opens my students' eyes to, oh, well, somebody could use that data to do something bad. Maybe I shouldn't share this. So just kind of bringing that in a little bit. And then professional codes of conduct. I always bring up the ACM. I also talk a little bit about the cybersecurity code of ethics that I know is on the CIE website as well. And I kind of liken this to medicine. Doctors are taught kind of the levels of dosage for what could be harmful, what won't be harmful, and all of those types of things. It's kind of the same for adversarial thinking in a lot of different areas. These are the things that could potentially put some issues in our system. And we have to know that those are things so that we're not going to build them in by accident, or we're going to be doing things like that. So I kind of like to bring up all of these pieces. And I try my best to, anytime I introduce something that might have them thinking like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Trying to just inject a little statement about ethics or, how we should be kind of conducting ourselves professionally, I think has been kind of my tact at it. I don't know if anyone else has worked with this extensively and would care to share. But I do think that teaching adversarial thinking and ethics almost in tandem is one way to kind of go about doing this. And I'll give my count to 10 again.
All right, so it's Elizabeth. I'll pop in again. I make sure there's some kind of ethic ribbon woven into all of my classes, from the intro to cyber class. Ethical hacking, I point out on the first day, the first word of this class is ethical. So we're going to be talking about ethics a lot. So we have to include that in our discussions. I think it's a lot easier for say the sociologists and the criminologists, because they're looking at the criminal side of things. But if we're not talking about it from the security side of things, then we're doing our students a gross injustice. So I try to weave it in there all over the place. And like in an intro to cyber class, one of the things I bring up is copyright.
Yep, intellectual property.
Right. And intellectual property theft. And it gets them really looking at things very differently, because as we all know, college students tend to share content. We'll just say, videos, music, what have you, movies. And so when I show them how much it costs the artists, and of course, most of them have like a favorite artist, and they're like, oh my God, I'm robbing from my favorite person, So it really gets them to start thinking about things differently if we find a way of attaching it to something that they like. But yeah, I agree. We have to include this through the whole path, or we're not really getting the job done.
I completely agree. We have an ethics class, and it's like a 400 level here at Towson, at least. And I teach classes that are not 400 level. So a lot of them haven't necessarily taken that yet. But it's always great to see when I get to my ethics section, which is actually like my second module. They already have been introduced to these ideas. And I think weaving it in is super important. And at least at my school, I kind of like that it's almost like an end piece because now they can connect everything that they've learned and all those little ethics things together into their one kind of class that they're covering it and they can talk about it. I've never taught that class. I'd love to teach that class. I think it would be very interesting to see kind of the end of all of their ethics learning. But I completely agree. Weaving it in is key. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you. Okay. So, I just kind of wanted to go through a couple of examples of where I integrate adversarial thinking into my classes and into where I teach. I have provided, I think, for every single topic, at least one activity that I have done in class, or a homework assignment that I've done. And there's links and they're all on the slide, so I'll share these out after. So the first one, my first lesson that I teach in my intro to cyber, and I also go through this in some of my other courses as well. I taught an enterprise systems class for one semester. And I actually use this POM, I think it came from Gen Cyber actually, where I teach the principles of confidentiality, integrity, availability, defense in depth, keep it simple, and thinking like an adversary, kind of all together. And I do weave them all back to thinking like an adversary. That's actually the first one that I talk about in my lecture. And then I kind of weave it into the rest of these. The way I do it for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is the CIA triad, is to actually use the DAD triad. And if you're not familiar with that, this is kind of the opposite of the CIA triad. So the DAD triad is really looking at it from an adversary's perspective. Understanding how confidentiality can be violated, and that would be through disclosure. Integrity would be violated through alteration of data, and then availability would be violated through denial. And I asked my students to kind of come up with some ideas of like, okay, what would be something that would be disclosed that would be bad? And a lot of them are like, well, my social security number, my home address, my grades. And that is a really great way to tie it into when I talk about like FERPA, and even talking about their own PII, so that they can start to connect these pieces across what they're learning. Integrity is one that I have found is a little bit more difficult for my students to get their head around. I've been trying different examples, and some of them stick, as I've noticed, for my more IT students. And then there's some examples that really stick for my cyber operations students, which I found very interesting. So in terms of like integrity for my cyber ops students, the one example that has worked for them has been the idea of a database. If I start changing those unique IDs for someone and you have it saved as a foreign key somewhere, what kind of harm could that do? And that really connects with them. But then when I start talking to my IT students, when I'm talking about, okay, well, if somebody, alters the password of a specific, Cisco router that you're working on, or if you are going to be changing the passwords that are shared among a team, how does that affect the integrity of that data? So I've had to try a couple of different things. I have like PowerPoint slides upon PowerPoint slides of examples. So that's something that I found has been like kind of interesting to teach. Availability, that one's actually the easiest one. I'm like, if you can't get to it, then you can't use it. And what's very interesting is I always bring up the point of somebody changing your password, which technically violates integrity, but can also affect your availability. If you can't get to that system, even though you are an authorized user, that is violating technically two parts of this. And what's interesting is that my students, once they kind of get the hang of it, they do get very into some of the homework assignments that I give, where I'm asking them to kind of describe these different ways that all of this kind of impacts information security. So this has been super helpful for my students in terms of like starting to introduce that idea of thinking like an adversary, since this has worked into like my first lecture in a lot of my classes. This is an activity that I have them do kind of right after I introduce that DAD triad, where I give them a statement and I ask them to identify what part of the DAD triad. So this one, if someone were to get into the class registration system and remove all students from CIS 377, that would be alteration. And then I usually ask them to like explain some different ways. The next one, this is the intellectual property one that I always use as an example. We're a Coca-Cola school, so everybody likes to have their like bottle of Coke when they walk into my class. And the Coca-Cola formula is proprietary, so it is intellectual property to the Coca-Cola brand. So what happens if it gets published on Reddit? And that one, always disclosure, they can get that pretty easily. And then another one that I use, if a network gets flooded with so many requests, it's unable to handle regular traffic. And that's looking at denial. And I come up with some different ones every semester. The Coca-Cola one hits pretty good with my students, especially we have a place to eat right near where I teach. So they usually come in with lunch. So this is just one idea. You can come up with a lot of other ones. I do think this gets some students talking that maybe otherwise wouldn't be talking about these things. So I think it's a really great kind of way to build it in. Yeah. Bank account, that's a good one. I also saw Instagram. A lot of people are very protective of their Instagram accounts. And I had one student who had quite a bit of a following. That's one of their biggest fears, is that their Instagram somehow gets hacked. And it was very interesting to see like the value system kind of come up there. Okay. The next area where I will introduce adversarial thinking is in the software supply chain, and specifically in the secure software development lifecycle. I use the 5 kind of step one. I don't really use the 7, but I like this diagram. It's from a company that I've actually worked with their systems before, so I really liked their blog post about it. I actually have my students read the blog post in preparation for class, where we talk about the different security steps that happen at each of the steps of the software development lifecycle. So kind of looking at it from, we don't have a special secure software development lifecycle. It's the software development lifecycle with security built in. So when I talk about requirements, I give them a little bit of taste into risk assessment, and we talk a little bit about like what's the difference between a threat versus a vulnerability versus like an exploit, and how we can kind of talk about those and start using that vocabulary. When we're talking about design, it's a lot of the threat modeling and doing design reviews. Development, looking at static analysis. I talk about pull requests, which is something that they're probably going to encounter if they go out into industry, into an internship. Same thing with testing, looking at security testing and code reviews. And then deployment. My IT students, they tend to start learning about DevOps and developer operations. So being able to kind of figure all of that in as well. The homework assignment that I actually have them do for this is reviewing code for vulnerabilities, because part of teaching the software development lifecycle, specifically around development, is secure coding. I know that was a really big buzzword at NCEC, and it's been very much talked about in a lot of other groups that I have been a part of as well. So being able to teach our students some of the basics of secure software development, input validation, buffer overflows, making sure we're not susceptible to SQL exploits and things of that nature. So I wrote a small kind of node application. Most of my students do take some type of a web development class, so JavaScript is not foreign to them. And I basically asked them to review this code for different vulnerabilities and fix it. This one is going to be susceptible to cross-site scripting, because we're not cleaning any of the information that this form is taking in before it injects it onto the DOM tree. And I give them instructions on how to start the application, how to clone the repo, because I think Git is something that they should learn in here as well. And then I kind of give them like, this is what it should look like while you're getting started. And they can kind of do a little bit of a mini pen test on it, just kind of seeing what they can do, and seeing what happens. And then all they have to do is hand in the fixed app.js file, and then I grade it from there. And I know that this really came out of me wanting to give them more hands-on materials that they can use, and they can kind of talk about, especially if they're going into interviews or things like that. I got a lot of really good feedback for this. I think the biggest negative feedback I got back from my students was that they wish that there was more than just 2 vulnerabilities, because there was one that was a little bit tricky. It was like in a dependency that I had talked about. But they kind of wanted more, which I think is a good sign that they want to learn some more. But I'm going to be expanding this assignment a little bit more to give them some more opportunities to read vulnerable code and really start understanding it. When I teach network security, this is probably one of my favorite things to teach. I love being able to take that, defense in depth model and be able to visualize it with them as we're going through the OSI model. Taking this idea of a castle, I know that's how I was taught to teach defense in depth, and I think it really lends itself well to network security. So at each layer, we're kind of talking about, okay, what could go wrong? What are the things that are vulnerable? So kind of going through like a mini risk assessment and thinking like, okay, worst case scenario, what would somebody trying to do harm try to do? And we can kind of look at that from all of these different layers. And what's really interesting, at least that I found, is that there is going to be students who, at least in where my class is in the like order of classes, I have some students who have taken multiple levels of networking. But I also have students that have not taken their networking class yet. So being able to kind of connect this idea across a wide range of understanding of just networking has probably been the hardest part of teaching, adversarial thinking when we're talking about network security. But I can usually find some common ground with them, specifically in like the network and the transport layer, where they can start. They're like, oh, I know an IP address. I kind of understand how that works. Okay, well, let's talk about IPsec and why we needed to bring that about. They seem to really like the history. That seems to be something that they're really into. So that's just an example of network security. The class activity I do for this is a firewall rules, or setting up a security policy. I don't have them really do anything super fancy because, again, I have students that have never taken networking. I have students that have taken like 2 levels of networking already. So it's kind of a toss up as to what I'm going to get. But I try to walk them through kind of, okay, let's look at the rule. What type are we looking at? What's the source address? What's the destination address? What's the port? What protocol is running on that port? Are we going to allow it or are we going to deny it? And I usually have them work in small groups for this. It kind of helps the students that maybe don't have the networking background still engage with the material through their peers. And I think that has helped a lot. I used to do this as like an individual, like, okay, everybody do it, who wants to answer? But once I transitioned to like, okay, work with like your elbow partner, then we can kind of learn from there. And I usually show them one and then I ask a couple more questions just to see kind of where they're at. And if they're really struggling, I will almost circle back to okay, let's think about the source address. What does the source address tell us? Okay, what does this destination address? What does a wildcard mean? And then even further, sometimes I have to go all the way down to, okay, what is running on this port? Why would someone want access to that port? What does it do? And that seems to help students as well. So this is another area that I build in adversarial thinking when I'm talking about cyber attacks and defenses. And I know Deveeshree and I talked about this as well when we were prepping. If you're not familiar with the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, it's just one way that you could introduce your students to kind of the cyber attack pipeline, how these things happen, where they begin, where they end, all those different steps that kind of fall in there. And it has these 7 very tight steps. And the way that I introduce these is I go through each, and these are actually the slides from my class, where I talk about like, okay, what is reconnaissance? Where does it fit into the cyber kill chain? But then also giving some example activities of what an attacker might do. So I almost completely teach this lesson from an adversarial point of view. Okay, as an attacker, I'm going to monitor an organization's social media. I'm going to understand who their employees are. I'm going to scan the company's website for outdated software. I'm going to go check to see if they've left stuff on GitHub. And then I'll usually like kind of bounce this back to my students, say, okay, where else would you guys look for information? And sometimes I get a lot of engagement. They'll like pick a company. So they're like, oh, we want to check out Amazon. So they're like, okay, let's go in and see what's up with Amazon. And they'll go in and see like where they could potentially get more information. And I think it's really fun to do the reconnaissance. There's also a couple of labs, I'll talk about that in a little bit, with immersive labs. If you haven't used it, it's a great platform. They actually have some labs that are based around the cyber kill chain. And the reconnaissance one is really neat because it has them go through network logs in a Splunk environment. And it's all run in the browser, so anybody can run it. I don't need to like teach them how to use Splunk. They're able to kind of jump in and get started with it. And I think that's a really great piece of the cyber kill chain, getting them like actionable things that they can accomplish. And then for the rest of these, I kind of just go through the same thing. What is weaponization? Giving them a bunch of example activities of what an attacker could do. My students tend to struggle with like the differences between all of these steps. And I know that like when I was starting to learn this as well, there's a lot of them that are similar. And I found that the example activities and kind of putting their hat on, for a lack of a better word, for being an adversary in this specific step almost helps them learn the definition a little bit more, because they could be like, oh, here's an example of what happens in there. Oh, there's an example of something bad that can occur. And I kind of do this for all of these. These will all be included in the slides, so we can include those as well. So delivery, exploit, installation, command and control, and then actions on objectives. And then this is the homework assignment. If you've never used immersive labs, they do have a lot of hands-on pieces. They all launch in the browser, which is really nice. Your students don't have to necessarily have a specific setup or any type of special software. They can just launch it right from the browser. And there's, I believe, 7 different labs that they can do that cover the 7 steps of the cyber kill chain. And they all have activities that are specific to them. My students really like these because they can get that hands-on and really start to understand the differences between the different steps when they walk through all of the labs. I think in total it takes about an hour and 15 minutes ish to complete all of them. So I find it to be a really good homework assignment for my students, just because they have, enough time throughout a week or a 2-week period, depending on how long I assign it, to really get into it and start to understand it. And then that way I can pull it into my exams as well. I can ask them to like answer questions or write a short essay about it. I work this into social engineering as well when I talk about the social engineering attack cycle, specifically in the prepare and infiltrate stages. So when I talk about prepare, I like to teach OSINT, and I think this is all about adversarial thinking. And I do love the OSINT framework. If you haven't used this tool, it's really great to get your students kind of just like understanding, okay, where's all this information available? What type of information is available? The one thing that I started doing this semester, actually, I asked my students, have you ever asked ChatGPT about you? Just ask them, do you know, insert your name. And some of them were actually very surprised that it pulled from a few websites that they're like, oh, I had no idea that that news article would be relevant, or that they would be able to find me through there. So it was very interesting for them to kind of start thinking like, okay, if I needed to find information about somebody, where would I go find that? And OSINT, this tool specifically, this framework, got them talking and really engaging during class, which was really fun. When I teach infiltrate, I use a little bit of psychology and sociology here. So when I'm teaching how phishing emails are built, and I know Elizabeth had to jump off, but talking a little bit before about like having them build those emails that are there that could be potentially harmful. So understanding how these things are built, I like to teach this theory because I think it has some nice kind of blocks that they can start to understand the different areas that an email or a text message or a voice message or things like that can be built around. If you're not familiar with it, there's a couple key elements. I think there's a few more, but these are the ones that I teach personally. So basically just teaching them, if someone gives you something as a human being, you're more likely to want to return the favor. And you can build that into phishing emails. If there's some value in you that gets activated, you're more likely to behave consistently with that. So how can we kind of organize that and really start to understand, how somebody can use that against us? We can also look at social proof. This is a really popular one that my students are like, I've seen this before. There's 300 people with this in their cart. And those can be done for good reasons, or they can also be used for bad reasons. So kind of looking at it from there. And then a couple of the other ones, my students really have a hard time getting between liking and reciprocity, which I've always thought was very interesting. But I had some insight into why. They're like, well, if we're gonna do something for someone, they want us, we want them to like us, right? So isn't that technically liking? I said, yes, but we're really more so looking at reciprocity. So it's very interesting to see my students really starting to get the difference between the two. And this is just one way to teach it. The way that I kind of try to hammer this into them during class is I give them some different types of phishing emails, phishing websites. I've done text messages in the past, and I ask them just to identify, okay, what parts of that theory is this exploiting? And what are areas that it's maybe could be exploiting but aren't doing well? So almost asking them to revise it. And they seem to get very into this activity. I enjoy this one. I like pulling all the different examples when I'm going to revise my slides for that semester. And I think making it timely also, fitting it around things that are happening in the world has helped as well, kind of understanding those pieces. Cool. And this is the homework assignment that can be attached there. You can download it from Clark, actually. It's not my homework. It's from Blair Taylor. She has a really great kind of activity where there's, I think, 10 different examples, and they have to bring it back into that theory. But then they also have to use parts of that theory to build their own phishing email and explain the different areas that they're kind of exploiting in there. So those are kind of all of my examples. I know that we are coming to a little bit under an hour and 15 minutes. So I kind of wanted to throw it back to you guys. Do you guys have any other examples of where you weave adversarial thinking into your teaching? Or did you get some ideas today? I hope I gave someone an idea. Well, that's all I have for you. The slides will be posted, and this will also be posted on YouTube. So if there's any of your colleagues that you know that didn't get to watch or log in today, I want to thank you all for being here and listening. I will see you all. Please don't forget, we have our next workshop next month on the 22nd, and it's going to be on extracurriculars. Really excited to have that one, talking about competitions and all the extra things our students can be doing. So I hope everybody has a great weekend. I'm going to stop the recording now. If I can find the button.